Welcome to this edition, June 15th, 2025, the Coast Virtual Meetup. Tonight we're going, or this morning, we're going to do a quick build clinic. This is the one that we did at the auction a couple of weeks ago, and go through that, and then just have a general discussion afterwards. So with that, what I'll do is jump over, and we'll go ahead and go through go talk a little bit about this build and how it was put together, etc. So this is a model of the Pajaro station. The Pajaro station is a station on my modular layout. This is actually modeled after the Agnew station, which is in Santa Clara, and it's where the California Central Coast Railroad is. It was called the railroad stop for the great asylum for the insane. As most of us know, Agnew was one of the California state hospitals until they were shut down. And this was actually the place you went on the railroad when you either went to the asylum or went to visit the asylum. Just a quick word, I'll put this up again at the end. You can either use the tiny URL or the QR code to access a PDF of this presentation. So no need to try to take any pictures or try to grab anything during the course of the event of the little talk here. So with that, I will go ahead and just get going. So this is the station that I modeled. This is the Agnew station. Agnew was Abram Agnew gave the land to the South Pacific Coast to build the station in 1877. It was a station on the South Pacific Coast until that was taken over by the Southern Pacific in 1887. When passenger service was totally terminated in the early 60s, the station was sold to the California Central Model Railroad Club, and they have actually used that for their facility for a number of years. It's a historic landmark. It has a historic landmark plaque on it in Santa Clara, California. I started by taking some pictures from the internet. These are some pictures you can find on the internet. You can see the front side of the station at this time. There was some rebuilding and work on it on the side towards the tracks, which is the bottom left. The upper left is the back side of the station, and then a picture of the end of the station. And as you can see, the windows at some point were shortened on the end of the station. You'll see that as we go through the design. The roof has been replaced with a composite roof and some other things as it's been modernized. I did throw in a picture of the interior. For those of you who haven't been to the California Central Club, these are some pictures of the interior of the station. You can see it's only 14 feet wide, but they have a fairly long layout that fills the 14 by 57 foot building inside. I was able, from the South Pacific Coast, or excuse me, the Society for the Preservation of Carter Railroad Resources, which is at Ardenwood in California, in Fremont, was able to get from their archives a couple of pictures of the station, historical pictures. The one on the left is an early picture. You notice it still says Agnew's. The one on the right is in the SP era. It says Agnew, and you notice the sign has changed to the more SP style sign where it has the distance to San Francisco on one side, and I'm not sure which was on the other side on this one specifically. You also notice that in the left picture, there's a ticket window right behind the little boy's head that's standing in the picture. On the right, they've added a vestibule underneath the eaves, and extended the office out there, and the ticket window is moved inside. When you see the ticket window I designed for the interior, I actually used the picture on the left as the inspiration for that ticket window. I did throw in a few pictures of the model. The model, as I'll talk about it, slightly compressed because of length and the space I had available. Like I said, I did decide to call it Pajaro because that fits into my modeling, which is basically primarily around the Pajaro Valley Consolidated Railroad from Watsonville to Moss Landing. So we'll do is a few more pictures and then a couple of shots actually where it sits on the layout. And I'll talk about how it sits on the layout in a moment. This is the module that it goes on. This is a fixed module. I'm taking my modules that I've built for over the years for the California Central Coast ON30 modular group and putting some of them in a fixed installation in a game room that's I'm turning into my train room. This is a 8 by 4 foot, fairly large module that sits in a corner. It'll be permanently mounted. In the back, you have some industries, a beet loader, and behind that, a produce shed and a brewery. And then up in the front here, you see where the station is. The way I typically do buildings is I use masonite or plywood, decide on the base for the building, then wrap that in plastic wrap with tape, screw it down to the base with a couple of drywall screws to the wood underlayment. And then I typically use Sculptamold to build the scenery base for the module above on top of the plywood. And so that just goes up against the plywood. And then when you pull it out, pull the plastic off, you now can build the model off the layout, install it on the layout. And it's really easy to remove it if you decide at some point in the future you want to make changes or take it to a new location. One quick hint, when you do this, after you get done with the Sculptamold, take the piece of wood and run it back through your table saw and take a small 32nd of an inch off of each side, and that way it slides easier into the opening than if you leave it full size where the Sculptamold is very tight. I started off by doing a field visit to the structure. What I did was I prepared in PowerPoint. If you've been around on some of these presentations I've done, I use PowerPoint for a lot of development of images. These were a couple of sheets I printed out from a PowerPoint slideshow of the measurements I wanted to get off the building. So all the little red boxes are measurements. This was, again, based on those photos that I got off the internet before I went to the building. I went down to do on-site measurements. I took my 100-meter tape with me, but what I found was there's this great tool, which actually my wife turned me on to, which is on your phone, called the Measure tool. So if you haven't used that, I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well because I have my background on, but on your phone, you got this Measure tool. And what you can do is point the tool at a location, click the button, and it actually locks that location. And then you can move the phone to another location, click it, and you get the distance measurement between the two locations. What I found was it was really easy to measure the building using this tool. So, for example, this is the back wall of the building. What you have is a window, a door, a window, and then a freight door. What I was able to do is just start right here, click the phone on that location, move down to here, read out the output, move down to here, read out the output, move down to here, read out the output. And then those were actually put on the drawings. So doing that, I literally was able to measure the entire building in less than a half an hour. It was quite impressive, much easier than using a tape. So these were the outputs. You'll notice that a couple of things I didn't do very well. I didn't get any measurements off of the dormer. I did get some height measurements, but they weren't as good as I really would have liked. I kind of missed some of those. But I was able to take that and generate a measured drawing of the existing building where I got all the dimensions, where the windows were, et cetera. And then I was able to turn that into what I kind of wanted things to look like. And I'll talk about the windows in a moment. But what I decided was that I needed to go from 57 feet, which is what this length is up here, to 47 feet, because my wood block I had pre-made was only 12 inches. So to do that, I actually did some compression. I decided I didn't want to compress the office much because I was going to have these windows and it was going to be very open. So I kept it about the same. What I did was I did about 28% compression on the baggage room and about 20% on the waiting room. So that got me down to the 47 feet I needed. So these were actually the dimensions that I used. And when I talk about how I, cutting the siding, et cetera, I used those dimensions. While I was there, I also took a bunch of fixed photos of the building. The club has repainted the building into SP colors, which is probably quite appropriate because that was the majority of the time the building was there. I got more pictures for clarity in kind of my design and building. Took some pictures of the architectural details. You'll notice, for example, the lightning rod up in the upper left is still there, the base of it, but the top of the lightning rod, which was could be seen in those black and white pictures, is not there. There are some under eave supports that I did want to model. The other thing that I realized I took these pictures was that they basically built mantles on top of each of the windows. And that became very problematic because it was hard to go find any commercial windows that would in any way match that profile. So using those details, I was able to get a lot of measurements. For example, I knew the width of the door here, and I was able to use that measurement and do, essentially ratios in PowerPoint to determine the measurements of the different parts of this mantle or whatever you want to call it on top of the door. Same thing with the under eaves supports, et cetera, et cetera. What I realized was, if you look on the left here, this was a T-shear Grant line window, and I realized that trying to put the structure on top of that window is going to be as much effort as just doing the whole window. So I decided to go ahead and design all the windows and doors. I use FreeCAD predominantly as my CAD program. It's basically a Fusion 360, but open source equivalent. So these are the typical doors and windows that were done. What you see is the window and door has the basic frame. This at the top was done as a block and then cutting away the surfaces to give the profiles that you see here. So each one of those was done individually and repeated. This was the door at the end of the freight house. You'll notice the bars were actually done in the print. Did the same then for the doors in the bay window. What I realized when I looked at the bay window was that these trim boards probably went all the way through the window. So I actually designed that window where it has the horizontal trim is part of the 3D casting, but the vertical trim is actually the wood that's actually put on the building after installation. So these were all designed, and Fran Foley, who has a resin printer and is good at resin printing, agreed, thankfully, to print them for me. So I sent them all over to him to had them printed. So for example, if you look at that matching the prototype, this is what you see. This is that piece you saw with the horizontal pieces, and this vertical piece, the trim wood goes up through the window casting. The lightning rods, like I said, they actually went up through the roof at the ends and had a lightning rod at the top. That's since gone, but actually I designed these with the lightning rod on them. If you're familiar with how to use CAD programs, these are done by extruding pieces up. This is extruded a rotational item. It's fairly reasonably easy to do once you figure out how a CAD program works. The same thing with the eave supports. What I did was, because I needed to be able to connect these to the wall other than just trying to glue them on the wall, because I knew they just instantly break out. I put a hole in the end of the eave support here, so I could put a wire into the wall to hold it when it was installed. The next step was very simple. It's cutting out the wood. I used Northeastern scribe siding. It's 3/8 inch scribe siding, which comes out to 9 inches about in O scale. That seemed to match the siding that was there, that had about 8.5 to 9 inches in the gap between the boards. The gap's a little wider than the scribe siding, but my assumption was it really wouldn't be that noticeable. Like I said, I used this design to cut out the walls. I actually draw right on the walls with pencil. Some people say draw it reversed on the backside. I always find that gets very confusing to try to make everything reversed and make it work out well. So I just do it on the front side. If there's an issue where you drew a line, I draw the lines fairly light with a hard pencil, and you need to move it. I find that a little 400 grit sandpaper removes any lines very well. The walls were all cut out laid out using a square and a standard scale ruler. The cuts were done using either an X-Acto knife, or you'll see in the next picture I bought it at one of the train shows, a scalpel with about 100 blades, and I find that works really well for cutting these things. The other thing that I did buy a while back was one of these micro mark cutters. I have a 6-inch and a 12-inch version of these, and I highly recommend them. If you look and see all the scratches here where my knife has run off, You can kind of imagine how bad that would be if your fingers were holding down something like a scale ruler there. So these work very well to protect your fingers and give you a nice smooth cutting surface. You see here the scalpel. These work really well. You just kind of open up the scalpel package and push the handle in on the blade, pull it out and use it, and they're very sharp. This is actually the dormer. And you can see what I did was after I cut out the dormer, I sanded it right here a little bit to match the slope of the roof, and then added on these little supports to be able to support it when you put it in place, to hold it at the right angle. One thing to notice here, this is the interior of the window frames. Again, this was 3D printed, but I painted all those brown, and you'll see that on the rest of the building, that was important because where you have this printed interior, it's a photo print interior. You actually see the inside of the window, and you want that painted to match the interior, where the outside is green to match the trim painting. One of the things I did at this point was I used the walls after they were cut to lay out the printed interiors. So the printed interiors were done in PowerPoint. I use a large slide. You'll see that in a moment, but you have to get the exact distances between each of the items because in the end, the printed interior needs to line up perfectly with this cut in the window frame. So you see what I did here was I printed something and was a little bit off with my measurements here and here, and I'm doing a little bit here to match it up. So a little bit of that actually turns out to be, which at this point, a little bit of extra work. The structural supports for the walls are wood where it's not visible. But for example, this wall has a printed wall, is going to have a printed wall interior. You'll see that a little bit later. So it'll be a printed wall with wainscoting and paintings, etc. What I didn't want was a square block that was 1/4 inch in this corner. So what I did was I used some 3/16" brass angle. You can see this white here. I tend to use canopy glue for almost everything now instead of white glue. I like the way it adheres better, and I think it's going to hold up longer than white glue does. So those were just glued on with white glue. You'll notice I had to extend the wall height a little bit. So this piece on the interior is actually extending the wall height. Prior to putting these braces on, the interior side of the wall was sprayed with just gray primer, rattle can Rust-Oleum primer. Did that because I knew when I did the outside, I was going to be putting some craft paint on it or something else. I wanted to make sure that I kind of prepared the inside to manage warpage when I got some paint on the wall. This is the long wall that's on the back side of the building away from the tracks. And you can see what I've got here is blocking across the top with spaces where the interior walls will go in and line up. On this end, I've got the brass angle because this wall is going to get the photo print. I decided fairly early on that the baggage room would not be modeled open. It would be closed. And I did that for 2 reasons. One, just didn't want to try to model the baggage room effectively. And 2, I wanted to use it as a way to bring electrical power up to the lighting for the office, which is in this area, and the waiting room, which is in this area. The last thing to note here is at the bottom, I glued on some 3x6 O-scale wood with the 3-inch side glued to the walls. That was done for 2 reasons. One, to have a bigger gluing surface to glue these walls down as I assemble the structure. But because if you go look at the actual pictures, there's not really a foundation line in this building. I'm actually mounting the walls directly to the base, and I wanted to have the floor on the inside up a little bit. So what I did was I put this at the edge, and then before I put the floors in, I put some more 3x6s on the masonite to raise the floor level up that 3 inches to match this. And the doors were actually made to match as well. So it all kind of looks like the floor is just slightly higher than the dirt on grade, which, if you look at the building here, you see, if you look right here, you can see how close the door is to the ground on the outside. There's no visible foundation on the building. For paint selection, I tried a combination of craft, rattle can, and true color to figure out what was my best option. After doing a bunch of evaluating and that, I decided to use Rust-Oleum. This is I think it's called forest or meadow green Rust-Oleum rattle can paint for the trim, and this is called wild wasabi craft paint for the walls, and those seem to match best what was in these pictures, which I kind of used as my color. These were done based on the SPC colors, were picked out by the club, and I decided those were as close as I could get without trying to go find color pictures which don't exist. Trim pieces were painted very much the way you typically do trim, some reversed tape on a board, stuck the pieces on, spray painted them with the green paint on both sides. Then all the trim pieces, after they were painted, they were rubbed with white powdered chalk. I use white powdered chalk. I buy the chalk sticks, use a micro grater that comes from the dollar store in a little glass bowl, grate some white chalk and rub it on with a stiff bristle brush. And that actually gives them a little bit of a view of being faded and not that heavy duty color that you get directly out of the Rust-Oleum. After that, then they were sprayed with a matte clear, which is the dull coat equivalent, the Rust-Oleum equivalent of dull coat, so much less expensive. And the insides of all the doors and windows were painted with brown craft paint at this point, just so that when you looked at them and after they were glazed, the inside would look brown and look like it was actually trim wood, not the exterior wood. Did the same thing for all the trim pieces. They were first grained with a razor saw. Had comment that my graining is really too thick for real wood, but I kind of like the effect you get in a building when you have some graining on it. And they were then also sprayed with the Rust-Oleum and the same white technique with some chalk to basically dull them down a little bit so they look slightly faded. So these were all the walls after they were assembled with all the bracing, etc. So you see the different pieces here. This is a front wall. This is a front wall. This is a front wall. This is the back wall up here. This is the baggage room side wall with the high window. This is the waiting room wall. And these are the two walls in the office. In the office, I decided to add some wainscoting, which is again just that same 3/16" scribe siding, and then painted brown. This part of the wall, as you'll see in the next couple of pictures, actually got a photo printed interior of my interior that I was planning on, which is kind of a colored wall, like a plastered painted wall. Then all the walls were painted with that apple green or with wild wasabi craft paint. That was just applied with a brush, undiluted. It was rubbed in to give uniform coverage. I was not trying to do a building that looked faded. To my mind, when you're building a building that's in the teens or 20s in an active use, it wasn't going to look faded like sometimes you see buildings with the heavy fading or the heavy stippling of the paint or peeling of the paint. So this was painted just to give the look of that old paint having been painted on wood. After the paint was dried, the windows and doors were all installed with canopy glue. And then I did the freight doors. The freight doors are just basically the same scribe siding turned 90 degrees vertical and then with trim glued on around it. One thing that what notice is when you do this, use a Rust-Oleum rattle can paint to paint these pieces. When you go cut them in your chopper, the ends are white. What I find is if you just spray a little bit of the spray paint on a piece of paper, you can just dip those ends into the paint and that colors them before you install them. So that basically got the walls completely done. The next step was I did the wall weathering actually again on the workbench. So I try to do as much as I can of the work to put this together and make it look good as flat pieces on the workbench. So the walls were basically done primarily with chalks. The first is that I used white chalk, and you'll notice if you kind of look at the wall here, you can see I started about here and made it heavier as I went down. So you get this kind of faded look in the wall, which is what you get below the eaves in a building, where the eaves protect the upper part of the wall and you don't get as much fading, you get more fading below. And then I used some black and brown chalks to add some dirt on the base, just make it look like it was kind of positioned there. One note here, you do see down here at the bottom, this is actually that interior wall on one of the waiting room walls glued on. So this is actually a photo print And then this is a cutout for where the ticket window will go. So this door and these pictures and the wainscoting are actually directly on the wall. And when you look at it through the windows, because the windows constrain your view, the fact that it's really two-dimensional doesn't look like two-dimensional because you have a very constrained view of the building. At this time, I also put in the brass wires for those eave braces. I measured down the right distance. Turns out I was probably about 2 inches low. I should have been a little bit higher, but those were put in, and then they actually go into, into the hole in the end of the eave braces. So they glue in very solid at the top, and the glue at the bottom just holds kind of the angle and position on the wall. And then the last thing I did was added on the signs. You'll see how those were printed also as photo prints. So they're cut out, weathered off the model. Techniques I did in a video you can find on the Coast YouTube channel about using PowerPoint. So these are done with a little bit of rust, the Dr. Ben's rust, and a little bit of alcohol. And then after this was all put together at this point, the windows were glazed on the inside with 0.010 acrylic. I bought a package of that from Amazon. Makes very good window glazing. It's easy to cut. I find it's very challenging to work with the microscope slides and do that. This is kind of a closer view of that interior wall. So this is a photo print, and I'll show you how we did that in just a moment. So the other thing I decided was that I was going to do this as a roof on viewing building. I did a couple of buildings that are done in incredibly detailed interiors. And what I realized is that, for example, when we do a show with the ON30 group, I'm typically taking the roof off of one of the buildings so people could see inside. I decided I really didn't want to do that with this building. It's not intended to be that kind of a model. So the building was done where the roof should always be left on. And you'll see that when you see the interior lighting. And the interior then is viewed only through the windows, which allowed me to use this the photo printed interiors. So this is actually the PowerPoint deck that I used for the interiors. So on this upper top, each one of these is an interior wall in the waiting room. This is the paint for the above wainscoting wall in the office. These are the signs and some additional doors for the office. And this is the floor. The floor is actually also a photo print. The way these are done is each one of these walls is done as an individual slide. And as I talk about in the presentation about using PowerPoint is 300 dots per inch. So if you make the slide larger than the size you want to print it, you get more dots per inch. So this slide is actually 24 by 16. So it's 24 inches by 16, which if you multiply out with the DPI gives you a much larger count than if you did it as a 4 by 6 image. The red lines, by the way, are in the master, and those are 1-inch lines in the final print. Because what I do is I take this image and I go to Mike's camera, and I can get a matte print of that, a 4-inch by 6-inch matte print for 50 cents. So that 24-inch wide slide, when you print it at 6 inches, it's a 1200 DPI image. So it's incredibly high resolution. So, this is the wall up at the upper left as it prints out as an image. That's essentially what I gave to Mike's to print. And what you see, this is actually a picture taken down inside the final building. This is actually that wall in the interior of the building. But if you've seen the building, when you look through these windows at this wall, it turns out that it doesn't look flat at all because you're looking at it in a very constrained view in 2 dimensions. So the wall is actually built just as a series of objects. So the black is actually what I want to cut out. That's where you're going to actually see through the window. That's actually the window frame that's mounted in the actual wall. This is just a picture frame from the internet. These pictures are actually just sized and cropped to fit in each of the picture frames. The door trim is actually just pieces of wood that are used excuse me, these are actually just rectangles filled with wood. So if you go in actually in the texture tool, if you take a square like this in PowerPoint, and when you click on the fill, you'll notice at the bottom there's a texture. If you click on texture, you'll find these textures are built into PowerPoint. And you notice this one down here at the bottom looks a lot like kind of dark brown wood. This looks like light brown wood. Those boards are just this texture filled into the boards. And if you fill the texture in horizontally, then when you flip the board vertically, the texture becomes vertical. So very easy to do the texture wood framing, trim pieces around the door. The wainscoting was done very similar pattern. This is a piece of wainscoting I found off the internet. It was, I think, may have been on like a Home Depot or a Lowe's site of them selling wainscoting. What I did was I took that, and you'll notice I've rotated these back and forth. If you look up here, you can see there's a repetitive kind of dot here. I was trying to make that dot less obvious. So kind of rotating and moving around a little bit. And when you put this on the wall and you're looking at it through a window, you never see that. So this is essentially integrated together, then combined and grouped as a single object. The floor was done the same way. The floor, interesting enough, is all individual boards. So when you look at it, you can see that they're individual boards. They're different at the ends, and they have nails on the end of each board. Literally putting this together takes about a half an hour to do the whole floor. The way it's done is this is that PowerPoint slide, again, that 24 by 16 inch slide. What I've done is I've assembled this, and it's actually assembled board by board. So each board in here is an individual board. Now, you look at that and you say, gee, that must take a long time. It really doesn't, because if you notice at the bottom, there's a group of boards. What you can do is you can build up a group of boards like this. And these boards are all designed where they have the joints on 4-foot centers, like you would when you had joists underneath the floor. Once you've got a group like this put together, you group those, you copy it. And what you see here is this same image here is copied. Right here, you can see it's flipped end for end. This has been rotated horizontally. Then it's copied, and these two up here rotated vertically. So these four are all the same thing, but because the patterns move around, it's very hard to see that they're actually the same thing. So then what you do is you basically to get the boards, the way the boards are done is you take that drawing. This was the drawing I started with. I like the way these boards look. By the way, you'll notice that there's a watermark in the center here. So using this as a single object would be hard because you got a watermark. But what you can do is you can take that and crop it down to a single board. So what you do is you use the crop tool and you crop down to that single board. And it's actually really easy with the crop tool then to pick different boards out and get a number of boards. And with the crop tool, you can zoom in and you can use that crop tool to crop right in on the edge of the board and just get right at the color boundary that's in the picture. Then what I did was after I assembled the boards into a block, I added on these little four, these are just literally circles in PowerPoint. Grouped together as a group. What you do is when you make one of those up, then you copy it and you put the distance apart that you have your spacing, you copy them. Once you've done this for one line of boards, it's really easy to copy it and move it over and put it in the next line. So putting the nail holes on, again, takes just a few minutes. So then what you end up with an image in PowerPoint that looks like this. So this is all the individual boards, all the individual nail holes. You can now take this image and copy it and paste it into a slide, not as a PowerPoint image, but as a PNG picture image. That allows you now to crop it down to the 24 by 16 inch size, the size of the print. And you'll notice I did a brown background behind that. So if there was any openings in the lines where I put all this together, it would be brown to match that kind of intermediate line. So basically what you do now is you have an image that you can print for 50 cents and have a floor. Also did all the signs and interior printed items. So For example, down here at the bottom right, I wanted to put the door on the inside of the office. You notice I blocked up to match the wainscoting thickness, and then I printed these doors out and just glued them on. And again, when you look through the windows, they look really quite good. The signs here were done the same way. The Pajaro sign here, I'll show that in a minute. I did this two ways. This technique here is a way to actually make cut lines so you don't have any ink where you're doing your cuts. So you just put these lines on, so you line your tool up here to do these angle cuts. I did both, and I decided I liked it better with the black line around it. So these were actually done by cutting these out right on the black lines. You can see the post office, the waiting room, the Western Union up here, and then the pictures and things that are in the office came off of here. This is a California Central Coast logo I put together, and it's actually printed and inside as well. The ticket window was done as a filament print, where all of the exterior trim and the windows really were too finely detailed to do on a filament printer, so they were done in resin. But the interior details you can do in filament, they work really well. So this was designed as two pieces. This is the piece that goes out into the waiting room. It was designed with a little in slot here for tickets. You saw that on the previous slide. This is where the tickets, that printing came from. The interior was done in the office side, a little more basic. You'll notice that not as much kind of sculpturing on the trim and rounding, but it matched. And these were actually designed so that they clip together in the wall. So when you put them, they're put together, they give you a nice view on either side of the ticket window. And I was able to put a couple of figures having a transaction through the ticket window. So this is the assembly of the unit. It was assembled, the building was assembled to the base. Once it was all done, this is kind of a view of what it looked like after the assembly. I started with the back wall. Obviously need a square to get things nice and square as you put it in that first wall. I used some blocks here just for support. I got this from Frank Markovich. This is actually a lead block that weighs about 10 pounds and makes a really nice block to hold things down when you glue them down. After I got that back wall in, then I positioned the two office walls based on the width and the front. They're done square with the back and the width with the front based on this piece of wall. So those were glued down and weighted in place. You can see kind of the same thing. They're being weighted and held down. After I had that wall on, then this piece was glued onto the end of that, again with some weights holding it in place while it dried. Each one of these, you basically got to do it and walk away. Then the other four walls were just installed using clamps. I also find using some masking tape as a way to tension when you're gluing things together. Again, all these glue joints were done with canopy glue. The interior pieces were done same in FreeCAD, but were printed on, I have a filament printer, makes it pretty easy. So this is the dispatcher's desk that's right inside the window. It's printed, this was printed with this surface down on the printer. These handles here, for example, are a 0.4 millimeter wide line. So they print as a single line of filament. But when you paint them with a little bit of brass paint after you finish it, works out really well. These were finished with, I use caramel spray paint as my base for my kind of nice, what I think of as nice looking wood. And then they were dry brushed with a combination of mahogany and wood brown Vallejo paints. So, and I think overall it gives you a very nice look. This is the bench. It was again created in FreeCAD, kind of off of some designs I found of benches. And you can see a little bit of styration here, but when you look through the windows, quite frankly, you can't see any of that. It just looks like a really nice bench in the waiting room. The other thing I did was I did a lot of pieces of paper. What you see on the desk here, you really can't see them very well, but all these items here on the desk, those are all track warrants. This is actually the track warrant. This is what it looks like when it's printed. My camera couldn't focus very well. That's done the same way as one of those 4x6 prints. So each one of these is a track warrant. And you notice there are the lines here to do the cuts. These are envelopes. These are large envelopes and these are small envelopes because I was building a mail slot in the back and I wanted to put a lot of mail in the mail slot. So a little bit about how some of these things are done. These are the in Pajaro signs. I wanted to have a little thickness to them, so they were basically put on 0.1010 styrene plastic. I found this DIY craft industrial strength glue sticks, and it seemed to work really well, better than other glue sticks. So that these were glued on with the glue stick. Also used the glue stick for gluing on the interior walls. So after those dried, then these were cut out with I think with the scalpel, and then the ends were done with a black Sharpie pen. What you see over here is cutting out the envelopes. So, this is what it looks like. You've got the envelope with the little lines on it and a little bit of return address. These lines on the outside are where you line up your straight edge, and then you make horizontal cuts and then make vertical cuts, and you get literally hundreds of envelopes. So those were then installed. I did an interior piece. Again, this is filament printed. The lines here on this mail sorter are 0.4 millimeters wide, so they're a single trace of filament. Painted the same way, same brass color for the knobs, etc. This box over here is designed to cover. There's a wood corner block here in the corner, and I just wanted to cover it, so I made a cabinet here to cover it. And then what you do is just glue in those pieces of paper and some envelopes, because again, if it's a post office, you have to have a place to sort things. And you notice this was actually designed to include the trim around this window that's in the office on the back wall. It needed a ceiling for the building. I didn't want to do raw LEDs or buy fixtures, so I decided to actually do it myself and 3D print it. I wanted to have, and I think I've achieved this, kind of not a bright white fluorescent looking light, but more of an incandescent yellow like light. So what you see actually is, looking in the windows, you see light fixtures. You don't see LEDs. They have more of the look of what a light fixture would look like. The way that was done was I made these 3D printed ceilings with light fixtures. I'll go through real quickly how those were done. Those were then, after the LEDs were installed, I did some wood to position those at the right height. So these are actually just removable. You can just pull them out and remove them from the model. So there's actually, this is the front side of them, the side that goes, or down side that goes into the building. And this is the back side. And these pieces were just glued onto the right height that I wanted the ceiling depressed in from the wall height. And then I put some little pieces on just to hold them in place. So they just drop in. The way the ceilings were made is pretty simple. You start off with a square. That was done at, I think, 3 or 4 millimeters. And then what I did was I figured out where the holes I wanted for the lights were. So I laid those out and positioned them based on, well, I want about this distance between the lights and getting the light fixtures. Once I had that, then I laid out this pattern of breaks, which would give you kind of a coffered ceiling look. And those were actually done by doing octagons. And I made those octagons on the side, on one side here. They're spaced based on the distance between these holes. So take this distance and assume you want 2 lines there. So you divide it into 4, and then the distance from here to here and here to here is the same, and this distance is double that. So those were spaced and like that. And then you actually use, there's a tool where you can remove material in a CAD program. So those just remove the material to go across. So very simple to do this, once you kind of have the tools, techniques and tools in place. This is the waiting room roof. It was pretty basic. The office roof were a little more complicated because it had to angle down at the front under that extension that was built out. And I wanted to add a piece in the back that matched on the that framing I did around the corner block. So I added those on this roof before I printed it. The light fixtures were done, again, using the same tools. What you do to do this is the blue here represents the LED. Blue lines are construction lines. They don't print in FreeCAD. What you do then is design the light fixture, and it was designed so the LED would press in from the back. I tried doing it from the front, and I just didn't like the way it looked. So I decided it was better to have a thicker piece going up and be able to push the LED in from the back. And I'm using these warm white 3mm LEDs. I bought 30 of them for $9 on Amazon. So basically the way you do this is you design this shape, and you notice this shape runs all the way around. It's actually done so none of the angles are at anything other, or more than 45 degrees, because that means in a filament printer you don't get any support in here. Once you've got this design, you just hit the rotate tool. There's a rotate tool up here, and it literally just rotates this around and creates this image. You'll see there the break line, that's actually the line where this exists, and it's rotated around. And again, by doing the 45-degree, what happens is when this prints, it doesn't print any supports at all. It just does it and gives you a nice clean print. So basically I printed out, for the two buildings, 12 of those. And then I decided I wanted a lens. So using the same exact techniques, this is the LED, this is the sides of that holder we just saw. I laid out a pattern and created a lens. And I have some clear filament I bought for another project. So I printed this in clear filament, and it literally just pops in. So I painted these black, a little bit of brass around the bottom here, popped in the lens with the LED, and it gives you a really cool looking light fixture. You notice the roof was painted the same way, the caramel Rust-Oleum spray paint, and then dry brushed with brown paints to give that kind of wood look roof. And you can see over here, I took 3 of the lights and I daisy chained them. If you just do them directly off of 12 volts, they're just too bright. But if you put 3 in series, it knocks the voltage down enough to where you get a kind of a nice glowing LED that gives you light that looks much more realistic. So this is kind of what it looks like when you look through the windows and you see the ceiling and the lights. It actually comes out looking pretty good. The roof was built the same way, using kind of same techniques. It was done with 1/16" plywood. I 3D printed braces for the roof instead of cutting them out of wood, just because it's easier to glue them on. And I was also able to print in the print a little indicator, and then I put a line on the plywood. And by gluing them all at that line, it makes absolutely sure that the roof is totally square when you finish putting it together. So those were glued on one side, then they were glued on the other side. And then I put on some smaller, this is 1/16", which matches the kind of 3 inches on the underside of the roof where they have wood, that gave me the underside. So that's put on after I put the braces on. You notice I also put some little pieces in here. These are done. It's really easy once you know the angle of this to repeat it. And I put in these 3 pieces, and those are there for light control. In case any light escapes and comes up, you won't see it through the roof. And you see here also, I put in the lightning rod that you saw earlier, a couple of brass pieces with little simple printed caps on them to represent the vents of the stoves that would be in the building. So this is kind of what those look like when you push them up. This is that 3D printed piece. This is a piece of brass rod with a little 3D printed cap that was just printed on the filament printer. It was basically assembled, put together, and then I put some cedar shakes on. A lot of the shakes that you get are thick and look more like something very rustic. I found these shakes on Etsy. I ended up buying 3 of these, and I used a little over about 1.5 of the packages to do the roof. So they were stained with black and brown shoe dye and alcohol. I bought a bunch of shoe dye and alcohol and made up little bottles of colors. They were glued down with tacky glue. I did some additional alcohol to make things match, because it turned out the batch that I did, the second half batch I did was a little darker than the first batch. So I had to do a little more with alcohol cleaning up to make them look good. And the final weathering was done with chalks. And you can see here, by the way, the little gable roof over on the other side that's there. So basically, once you got everything kind of stained, then you do the streaking with chalks, because those things tend to be not go horizontally, but go vertically. And then the last thing I did was put in a little deck. The decks in the prototype photos were almost on the ground, as you can see. So they weren't off the ground because the whole building was seemed to almost be built on the ground. The deck is made up of individual 3x8 strip wood. I use 2x4s. You can kind of see them here. There's a 2x4 on edge there to represent the joist that would be in the ground, where most of it would be in the ground. The wood was grained using a jeweler's saw, and then what I do is I stain it with ink that's alcohol black dark ink, and then I grate a little bit of brown and black chalk onto it when it's wet, and that gives it much more of kind of a weathered appearance. And it was glued together with canopy glue. So that brings us to the end. This is, again, you can get a copy of this presentation. Either use tiny URL Coast Pajaro, or just shoot the QR code and it'll take you to the PDF. So that's all, folks. We finished just in time. Any questions, comments? Anybody awake?
Good presentation, Phil. Ever since the second or first slide, I wanted to ask you this question. Why is the engine house so skinny? I mean, in the Woods days, they would it was like just as wide as a railroad car. They'd throw it up in the logging guys and put it on a flat car and move the station to another place.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't think was movable. I think they just made it small because they didn't need a big station. I found, after I built this, I found a picture of the actual Pajaro station that was built in Pajaro, which is incredibly similar. It's got a little bit different details on the ends, but it's also very small. So I think the reality is that they just didn't build them very big because they didn't need to. I mean, it's a small station, so
It's kind of like Disney-esque.
yeah, it is. I mean, it's only 14 feet wide. I mean, what's interesting is if you go into the building today and when you're inside, you realize it feels like a really long bedroom from a layout perspective because it's only 14 feet wide.
Well, that was the era of shotgun houses.
Yep. Well, and again, I think, the idea would be in a station like that, if you had 5 or 10 people getting on the train, that was probably a fairly big number. It wasn't like, it isn't like in a city where, the train pulls in and there are 200 people getting on the train. The only reason to go there, especially, if you go all the way back to when it was built, when it was built, it was basically probably a community of 50 people. And so, wasn't need for much of a station for that many people. Probably over time, it got more usage because of the Agnew, hospital that was built next to it, the asylum. But, it still was just a small station. And that seems to be, pretty typical. If you look at the Santa Clara station, clearly that's a much bigger station and a much bigger location. And it actually, in the pictures of the station, you can see in the background, the freight house is actually much larger than the station, which is probably, again, indicative that freight was more important than people. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, one question. Phil, was there any damage during the earthquake, 1906?
I could not find anything about any damage during the earthquake. And what's really interesting is, because I've done Moss Landing. I built a module based on Moss Landing. When I went looking for pictures of Moss Landing, I found a large number of pictures that were taken in 1906. And, because they had a lot of issues at Moss Landing. They've got, there's a great picture I've got of the rails where the Y went out to the ocean across a bridge out to the sandbar and then eventually out to the wharf that they had there. And you can actually see that those rails are lifted up and twisted from the earthquake. And then they have pictures of a lot of the buildings that collapsed. When I went and looked at pictures of the Agnew station, there were no pictures from 1906, which kind of makes me assume there wasn't any damage, because it seems like, you know, people didn't take a lot of pictures of these kinds of things because they were just everyday items, but they did when they were damaged in the earthquake. So the fact that they weren't readily, that when you put in, you know, Agnew Depot or Agnew's Depot, you don't get pictures of the damage from the earthquake, kind of says there probably wasn't much.
Yeah, there's a nice presentation there. There's definitely some stuff I'm going to look at the microwork catalog and get a couple of those guides, because I have recently come close to cutting my finger pretty bad sometimes. So
yeah, I notched my finger a couple of times, you know, got into it, right? You know, it slips, and I got to tell you, those are just so much better for protecting your fingers, and giving you good cuts. Cool. Well, I need to run. I had committed to go to a 10 o'clock O-Scale West meeting, so I'm going to bid adieu. If you guys would like to stay on, if somebody would like to stay as host, I can leave you as a host, or we can just call it this week and we can get together in 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks? Great. Well, everybody have a great couple of weeks, and we will see you in 2 weeks. And hopefully, I think Earl's going to do a clinic. He's got a clinic he said he was putting together. I don't know if it'd be ready in 2 weeks or if it'll be a little bit later than that, but hopefully we'll have a chance to have him come do a clinic. I always enjoy those. So y'all have a great one. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye now.
Thank you.